Up next here on C-SPAN, we take you to Capitol Hill for live coverage of a hearing held to investigate allegations of massive fraud, drug money laundering, and support of terrorists by the Bank of Credit and Commerce International, more commonly known as BCCI. The Senate Foreign Relations Subcommittee on Terrorism, Narcotics, and International Operations is held hearings this week to investigate BCCI. On Tuesday, a former BCCI official testified for the entire day about the secret ownership of First American Bank shares of Washington, D.C., and insisted that the former chairman and the president of First American Bank were aware that BCCI owned their bank. Yesterday, the subcommittee took testimony from the former chairman of First American, Clark Clifford, and the former president, Robert Altman. They told the subcommittee that they knew nothing about BCCI's alleged control of First American and suggested that BCCI might have been carrying on a secret campaign to control First American without their knowledge. Today, the subcommittee, under the chairmanship of Senator John Kerry of Massachusetts, is scheduled to hear about CIA intelligence monitoring of BCCI's activities. You will hear from the acting director of Central Intelligence, Richard Kerr, and from an official with the State Department.
Or obviously the degree to which the intelligence community had knowledge of BCCI's involvement in this country and elsewhere, and the steps that were taken to communicate that knowledge to various agencies of our government. Questions are raised about the CIA's use of a bank that had been known at an early time to be engaged actively in an illegal ownership in this country. And information about that has obviously been difficult to obtain. As we all understand, there are reasons for that, and I respect many of those reasons, and the committee is not trying to undermine fundamental notions of what is needed to be done in the course of intelligence work. We understand that, and I accept that, and as a supporter of legitimate covert activities, I think everybody understands that sometimes you need to use a bank and so forth. That's not what the committee is questioning. The committee is really trying to weigh, I hope intelligently and sensitively, the policy issues that are raised when you have conflicts between goals. It's inevitable that sometimes those conflicts will exist, and I am pragmatic enough and realistic enough to understand that there are times when tough judgments will have to be made, and sometimes one interest that is not so pretty will take precedence over another interest that is not so pretty. That's the nature of life and the nature of protecting the interests of the country. On the other hand, the question has to be asked, were those interests properly balanced? Was that, in effect, the decision that was made? Or did something happen where a succession of people dropped a succession of balls? Or was there just a kind of, for lack of a better word, negligence or inadvertence or overburdened bureaucracy that somehow didn't notice what was happening particularly? We don't have the answers to those questions as we sit here, and this is not an effort to try to point fingers of blame, at least at this point. It's really to try to find the facts and to learn what happened here. I think a lot of people are legitimately and genuinely puzzled. The first inkling that we had as a committee that there was an intelligence community involvement somehow with this bank, and not even at that time understood, was 3 years after the beginning of this investigation, when we first learned of a CIA report, and we learned that according to former Customs Commissioner William Von Raab, who had testified that Mr. Robert Gates had provided him with such a report because he had inquired about BCCI, and that he had learned in the course of an investigation of drug money laundering in Florida, which investigation resulted ultimately in an indictment of the bank and of officials of the bank. According to Mr. Von Raab, Mr. Gates referred to BCCI at that time as the bank of crooks and criminals. And at the time, he informed us that he had come across the existence of intelligence accounts at BCCI during the course of his investigation. Regrettably, there was a problem in really getting answers to the questions that we posed thereafter. We contacted the CIA twice and were informed that the report did not exist. 2 months later, after pressing significantly, the CIA, quote, found the report. The report was delivered to the Senate Intelligence Committee in a classified form on the ground that it contained, quote, extraordinarily sensitive information. When I received the report, and I say this as somebody who respects the notion that there is, incredibly intelligent, oriented, sensitive information, and it does exist. But when I reviewed the report, just as a matter of common sense and sort of basic judgment, I must tell you, I found nothing in my mind in it that could be classified as extraordinarily sensitive, let alone even that justified it being classified at all. It contained the revelation that the CIA knew back in 1986 that BCCI secretly owned First American and had told federal law enforcement of that fact, and that fact has since been declassified by Mr. Webster prior to his departure at my request. In the meantime, however, the rest of that report remains classified for reasons that I must tell you, frankly, I find very hard to understand. Subsequent to that, my staff, who were cleared at top secret level, requested a briefing of what the CIA knew about BCCI, and we were provided with briefers who were totally unfamiliar with the basic facts about the bank, including even the identity of a former head of Saudi intelligence, Mr. Kamal Adham, who was a central player in BCCI and whose name we've heard many times in the course of these hearings. In early August, on the very day that Congress was leaving for recess after all of our inquiries, Mr. Kerr, who's here today, appeared in public to give a speech to a group of students at the National Press Club, and indeed they were able to learn what we were not, which was that CIA itself had made use of BCCI. There were no questions at the time, but I must say that it struck me as ironic that a group of students at the press club were learning sort of formally from the acting director of this fact. Well, we had been pressing to get some information on it for a fair amount of time. Added to these facts is the fact that Mr. Kamal Adham, the lead shareholder in First American, apparently had a lengthy relationship with the intelligence community, and at least one other shareholder in the original takeover of Financial General Bank shares was a business partner of the former CIA director and ambassador to Iran, Richard Helms. Beyond this, we have statements by the finance minister of Pakistan, Mr. Sartaj Assis, who told the London Financial Times on July 25, 1991, that it was his understanding that the CIA made use of BCCI in his country to provide rewards to the Afghan rebels and Pakistani military officers coordinating that movement. This past week, we've received additional testimony from an officer within BCCI who in his sworn testimony stated that the former head of BCCI, Mr. Agha Hassan Abadi, believed he had been targeted by the CIA, but that is not a new belief by many people in many countries. And later, it was felt by some of the officers working with him that there had been some sort of relationship that had been been created. Mr. Sakia, one of the top officers in the bank in this country, also testified that he was contacted by the FBI for help in unraveling the involvement of BCCI in arms sales to Iran as part of the Iran-Contra affair. There are documents which we've obtained independently from BCCI that confirm a participation in planned arms deals in 1985 and 86. And while some of these deals may have been aborted in the end, they do appear to have been negotiated with important Iran-Contra figures like Adnan Khashoggi and Manucher Ghorbanifar, who was the arms merchant used by Oliver North and the NSC for negotiations with Iranian moderates. Yesterday, we learned for the first time from Mr. Altman that his bank, in fact, was a depository of the CIA, despite the fact that the CIA knew that First American was secretly owned by BCCI. These are the connections that obviously raise questions. Now, again, I want to reiterate, and I say this adamantly, I am not, in any sense of the word, an opponent of the CIA's need to have pass-throughs and to maintain secrecy. And this committee respects that concept. The chairman respects that concept. And I understand that there will be a need to have some of this testimony in private session, and we will do so. There is no effort here to try to question whether or not there isn't a justification for these kinds of contacts. The effort is to understand them and to understand the policy decisions that led to them and what knowledge was known at what time and what people thought ought to have been done with that, or what we think in retrospect ought to have been done with that. Similar questions arise with respect to the State Department. There were many signals in many different countries with respect to the culture of criminality, as it's been referred to by the Bank of England, though the Bank of England obviously didn't respond to that any too soon either. And the question is whether or not in the course of State Department efforts and so forth, there was a sense of unease or some knowledge or even some steps taken with respect to this bank that somehow we should have been aware of. And again, I don't want to, you know, there's a propensity up here in the United States Congress to look at things after the fact, and it's all clear as a bell, and people make a lot of judgments about things that I'm not sure any of us would have made or could have made at a particular time without the retrospective made available. So this is really fact-finding and not finger-pointing, and I hope all of you will just help us to understand exactly what took place here so that we can try to make some judgments down the road. I welcome all of you here and look forward to your testimony. I understand you'll have some opening statements, and at that point we can proceed with the questioning. Why don't we lead off, Mr. Kerr, with you if we can, and then after your opening, I'd like the openings from the State Department, and then we'll come back. Does that empty chair represent the gulf between the CIA and the State Department, or?
No, I think it's an accident.
It's an accident, like most of the, all right.
Quite simply, I didn't know that we were going to have quite this array here this morning.
Well, actually, I didn't either, but, you know, we welcome you. Thank you for
Mr. Chairman, thank you. First of all, I might say just in a general comment that as an intelligence officer for 30 years, I find myself a little reluctant in an open hearing to talk about intelligence sources, and intelligence methods, and the information that we acquire through that process. You pointed out, for instance, that you saw a report, or at least heard about a report that you didn't find particularly...
The mic a little bit closer, if you would. I think it'd be helpful. Thank you.
Saw a report that you didn't find the information in particularly sensitive, and I think often that is true, but our concern is not only the information that we get, but also the way we get it. And sometimes you can get information overtly out of a newspaper, and sometimes you can get it clandestinely, and it is the sources and the sensitivity of those sources sometimes that makes the difference between how we classify and not the information that is contained in the report. We are, and I am responsible, and you have indicated, you're clearly not trying to go beyond this process into the details of the intelligence operations, and I appreciate that.
Yeah, let me just say that I totally agree, and we're running into a lot of that in the MIA POW issue, and clearly sources indicate an enormous amount, and there is obviously a reason to keep sources quiet to protect them, sometimes their lives, let alone the network, and I understand that. In this particular memo, it was just a summary, written by somebody in the agency with no sources mentioned and no. So, I mean, I tried to separate that.
I understand, but sometimes it's rather difficult, and maybe it's difficult for us at times, to separate the information we get from the way we get it. So we are often looking at how we get it as the sensitivity rather than just the information. I might also say that in this case, it is extremely important from my perspective to protect sources and methods, because if I'm going, as an intelligence organization, if we are going to continue to collect against areas of important national security, I need to protect those sources, and I need to, the very areas I'm going to talk about today are not areas that are history. They involve activities and things that are ongoing and that are very important to the future. At the same time, one of the reasons I'm here is because I think it's important to clear the air, and I think it's important to about what CIA's and the intelligence community involvement with BCCI was, and I intend to do that as directly and as forthrightly as I can, while also trying to protect the information as best I can. I have a statement that's going to set it out in an unclassified form, and we will, as an introduction, let me state that CIA conducted a thorough review of its activities over the past several years with regard to BCCI. We've done that from the management point of view, from our own intelligence point of view, and we have also looked at, had an independent investigation conducted by our statutory inspector general. The results of our look at this, including the statutory inspector general, were provided to the Senate and the House Intelligence Oversight Committees, which is our principal funnel into the Congress. The Senate Intelligence Committee has conducted its own independent investigation of CIA's involvement with BCCI with the full cooperation of the agency and of the intelligence community. And we expect their report will support our findings on this issue and the points that I'll make subsequently. There have been, from my perspective, a number of outrageous and unfounded allegations of illegal or improper relationships between CIA and BCCI that have been made in the press and elsewhere. And I want to respond to several of those allegations directly. But first, I'd like to provide the committee with a perspective of the agency's foreign intelligence collection program against BCCI. CIA's foreign intelligence collection focus on BCCI began in the mid-1980s due to their suspected involvement in the narco money laundering. As a result of an initial successful intelligence collection operation, a larger operational program was developed in the time frame from 1986 to 1990. This operation focused on the people, the mechanisms, and the way that BCCI operated for narcotics money laundering as a specific objective. As a byproduct of our effort against BCCI money laundering, the CIA collected limited intelligence on such things as the manipulation of financial markets, weapons proliferation, and terrorism. CIA reported in early 1985 that BCCI had succeeded in gaining control of Financial General Bank shares in late '81. As you know, Financial General Bank shares later became First American Bank shares. During the period from 1979 to 1991, several hundred reports were produced by the agency's Directorate of Operations, which discussed BCCI activities. BCCI was also discussed in a number of finished Directorate of Intelligence studies, analytic studies where information about the organization was tied into larger discussions of terrorism and counter-narcotics. The CIA's intelligence on BCCI was disseminated to a number of U.S. government intelligence consumers, including Treasury, Customs, Commerce, DEA, NSA, DIA, Federal Reserve Board, the Department of Energy, U.S. Trade Representative, the Department of State, and the FBI. They were distributed during this entire period as information was received as individual reports. Now, I might add that not all of the reports went to all of the consumers. So there's some reports were earmarked for particular people, and some were sent to a larger number of customers. Some were rather limited. And that's one, I might also add, that's one issue where we've looked back at our own dissemination and are going to try to tighten it up a bit to be a little more consistent than we've been in the past. and try to make sure that we have a little better focus on our dissemination on issues like this in particular. As for allegations in the media of CIA illegal or improper relationships with BCCI, let me go down those directly. CIA did not assist or encourage, either by action or implication, any wrongdoing on the part of BCCI or its employees. CIA took no action, including withholding information, to influence or impede any existing or potential civil or criminal investigation or prosecution of BCCI. In addition to providing information concerning BCCI activities to law enforcement agencies, CIA registered no objection when it was consulted by law enforcement agencies regarding whether any CIA equities might be imperiled by an investigation or a prosecution. To the contrary, in all instances where the agency was consulted, CIA responded that law enforcement action would not impact on agency interest. The agency did not acquire intelligence on the decisions made by or the role played by major foreign shareholders in the operation of BCCI, including Kamal Adham and Adnan Khashoggi. And I'll go back to this point in a moment. With regard to BCCI in Panama, the agency collected intelligence on the use of BCCI Panama by major narcotics traffickers. With regard to the plans and intention of the chairman, Abedi, and senior BCCI management, the agent collected and disseminated intelligence on the overall corporate strategy of illicit activity in international financial markets. The allegation that the agency placed Abedi on a watch list or had a direct or indirect relationship with him or recruited him for CIA activities are baseless. CIA was not involved in any alleged BCCI black network or thugs and assassins as described in the press. CIA was not involved, nor did it have knowledge of any use of BCCI for the sale of arms to Iran or the diversion of funds for the Nicaraguan Contras in connection with the Iran-Contra affair. BCCI was not a major banking mechanism used by the agency for the support of covert foreign intelligence operations. It was used on an extremely limited basis for legal banking transactions. Accounts were also opened with the bank to facilitate acquisition of information concerning the bank's illegal activities. BCCI management was not witting of agency involvement in these activities. And let me say that again, because I think that's an important issue and one that we've heard some news about, and that is that BCCI management was not witting of agency involvement in these activities. In summary, from my perspective and in our review of it, I think CIA did its job and they did it well. The agency collected and disseminated strategic foreign intelligence on BCCI's illicit foreign financial activities to policymakers beginning several years ago. CIA disseminated that foreign intelligence through appropriate channels to the intelligence and law enforcement communities. CIA conducted a detailed and thorough investigation of CIA's activities regarding BCCI. No evidence was found of indicating any improper or illegal activity by CIA, and we feel confident that the Senate Intelligence Committee's investigation, as I said earlier, will reach that same conclusion. We have asked the SSCI to brief the chairman and other members of this subcommittee on its findings. And I would like to make one point that I think is important to put CIA's activities with regard to BCCI in some appropriate context. First of all, BCCI was a target, but it's important, I think, to understand that we are not an investigative agency or a law enforcement agency. What we were interested in doing was not trying to find wrongdoing per se and try to follow the individuals or detail their involvement. Our focus was on the activities that BCCI was involved in with regard to drug traffickers or trafficking, money laundering, terrorism, or arms deal. We were focused on larger strategic problems and issues, not on the bank itself or the individuals involved. And that's one of the reasons why when you ask us in some of the interrogatories that you've given us detailed information about individuals or about specific actions, in effect, those were not targets of our particular collection. We were focused on a set of activities that really went beyond BCCI, but were using BCCI as a mechanism. And I think that's an important consideration. And I would, as you've indicated, I'd be glad to expand on my unclassified comments in a closed hearing on additional detail.
Well, what I'd like to do, Mr. Kerr, is get you to expand in open session a little bit on certain areas here that I think ought to be a permissible area of inquiry. And as we discussed previously on the telephone, where we clearly understand that we're moving into an area that might compromise something, then we'll do that privately. But there are some things that I think we could articulate a little bit further that are raised just by your opening testimony here, and I'd like to come back to it if I can. Who's going to lead off? Mr. Cresco. Am I pronouncing that correct? Cresco. Great. Thanks. Just state your name and who you are for the record and go right ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm Alan Cresco, Deputy Legal Advisor at the State Department, and I'm pleased to introduce the Department's testimony concerning the foreign policy implications of the Bank of Commerce and Credit International scandal. As we emphasized in prepared statements submitted to this committee in August, the State Department has viewed this matter from the outset of the revelations of BCCI's control of First American as one properly conducted and controlled by law enforcement and bank regulatory officials. The Department has undertaken to cooperate to the fullest extent in assisting the various investigative efforts of the Federal Reserve and the Department of Justice. With the continuing support of our embassies and consulates abroad, the Department regularly provides direct assistance to the Federal Reserve and to the Justice Department in connection with their respective investigative efforts. Questions concerning the conduct of those investigations would need to be put to the law enforcement agencies involved. The committee has sought the Department's views on the foreign policy implications of the BCCI scandal. We will try to be fully responsive to the committee's questions. Of course, our assessments are preliminary, since various domestic and foreign investigations are still underway, and the full extent of the implications of this case may not have been disclosed. Moreover, an extraordinarily wide range of allegations has been made concerning BCCI. While the Department has conducted a review of its own files, we are not an investigative agency and have never been involved in foreign investigations of the various accusations that have been leveled against BCCI and its officers. I'm accompanied today by several Department representatives who will address areas that the committee has indicated to be of specific concern. Sitting at the witness table with me are Grant Smith, Deputy Assistant Secretary for International Narcotics Matters, who will testify as to what the Department knows about BCCI's role in narcotics operations and money laundering, and Lawrence Pope, Associate Coordinator for Counterterrorism, who will testify as to what the Department knows about BCCI's role in terrorism. Sitting behind me and available to answer questions as to what the Department knows about the foreign policy implications of the BCCI scandal in particular regions of the world are Richard McKee, Director of the Office of Arabian Peninsula Affairs, and Roberta Jacobson, Deputy Director of the Office of Policy Planning and Coordination in the Inter-American Bureau. Mr. Chairman, before turning to these individuals to address specific areas in detail, I would like to provide a general overview. First, as I've indicated, the Department has reviewed its records for material related to BCCI. The Department has relatively few records which pertain to BCCI from the 1970s or early 1980s. We have some reporting from the late 1970s on the establishment of BCCI branches in various countries. We have also located a 1978 biographical sketch of Abadi, which noted that BCCI engaged in, quote, questionable if not illegal activities, referring to BCCI's efforts to acquire Financial General Bank shares. In 1983, we received a request from New York state authorities for information about BCCI when BCCI sought to establish an agency office there. We solicited the view of our embassy in Luxembourg and specifically asked for any comment on trafficking in arms or controlled substances. Our embassy in Luxembourg responded at the time that BCCI was a prominent and reputable financial institution. Thus, our records from this period contained very little suspicious material about BCCI. This situation changed markedly in the mid-1980s when the department became aware of BCCI's involvement in money laundering and terrorism. Mr. Smith and Mr. Pope will explain, subject to classification considerations, what the department knew and how it responded. With respect to the foreign policy implications of the BCCI scandal, I would distinguish between the implications of our law enforcement actions on U.S. bilateral relations with the key country concerned and the effects of the BCCI scandal itself in various countries and regions. As to the former, U.S. law enforcement actions have not to date had a negative impact on bilateral relations with the key countries affected. Our relations with the United Arab Emirates remain very good. We have explained to the government that our actions are motivated solely by our efforts to enforce the law, and the United Arab Emirates has indicated from the outset its desire to cooperate with U.S. investigators. An investigative team from the Federal Reserve was received in Abu Dhabi last spring, and the UAE government subsequently made available a large number of BCCI documents to the Federal Reserve. More recently, the UAE government has received a team from the Department of Justice. In Pakistan, the initial public response was that the actions taken by the US and the UK were politically motivated and reflected anti-Muslim sentiment. However, as the breadth of the scandal has been revealed, Pakistani depositors have shifted blame to BCCI itself. There has been extremely close collaboration with the United Kingdom, particularly between the Federal Reserve and the Bank of England. There was the potential for a serious foreign policy dispute with the United Kingdom when the House Banking Committee subpoenaed the Federal Reserve for documents provided them in confidence by the Bank of England. Fortunately, an accommodation was reached with the Bank of England concerning congressional access to certain of those documents. However, we remain concerned that the issuance of the subpoena could have an adverse impact on the willingness of countries to cooperate in connection with subsequent U.S. investigations. The Department has also monitored more generally the impact of the BCCI scandal in countries across the globe. While the precise dimensions of the impact cannot be assessed until the various domestic and foreign investigations of BCCI are completed, we foresee the following: damage to the economy of certain countries, international legal tangles over regulatory jurisdiction, bank confidentiality, and the disposition of the BCCI Group's remaining assets, perhaps prompting reassessment of laws and regulations governing international banking, and in certain countries, adverse political fallout. While our analysis is necessarily preliminary at this stage, we can make a few observations on the current situation. The political fallout within Europe from the BCCI scandal has been primarily limited to the United Kingdom, where the government's oversight of BCCI has become a domestic political issue. The political impact in other European countries appears marginal. The scandal appears to have had limited political or diplomatic impact in Africa. However, the economic consequences in Africa could be considerable. According to press reports, Cameroon, Zimbabwe, and Zambia together could lose up to $200 million in assets. The BCCI shutdown could also adversely affect business activity in the Sudan, Botswana, Sierra Leone, and the Ivory Coast. In Latin America, the impact appears to be primarily political rather than economic, with governments opening investigations on BCCI activities and possible political corruption in Argentina, Peru, and Jamaica. In East Asia, local depositors have been hurt by the closing of numerous BCCI branches. The decision of the government of Hong Kong to liquidate the Hong Kong branch of BCCI led to angry protests, but it does not represent a major blow to the Hong Kong financial system. In the Arabian Peninsula and South Asia, some have chosen to see imperialist and Zionist motivations behind the West's attack on what is popularly viewed as a successful Muslim and Third World bank. In the United Arab Emirates, there is no evidence the scandal has eroded the hold on power of the rulers of Abu Dhabi or their popular base of support. The bank's failure may, however, create certain cash flow problems for the UAE. The ramifications in Pakistan will depend in part upon what is confirmed of the press allegations that BCCI operated an arms and drug smuggling operation from Pakistan. Closure of BCCI's 4 branches in Bangladesh will adversely affect its 70,000 individual depositors. The impact of the BCCI scandal on terrorism and narcotics trafficking will be limited. Although there may be temporary disruptions of some financial flows, most terrorist groups and drug traffickers will probably be able to redirect funding transfers through other institutions. Over the longer term, however, the scandal may lead international banks to be more scrupulous about their banking practices. With these introductory comments, Mr. Chairman, I would ask Mr. Smith and then Mr. Pope to comment in more detail on BCCI's role in money laundering and terrorism, respectively. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. I'm Grant Smith. I have been Deputy Assistant Secretary in the Bureau of International Narcotics Matters in the Department of State since October 11. My predecessor, Parker Borg, outlined in his statement in August what we know about BCCI and actions we have taken to deal with narcotics money laundering. I'd just like to draw a few comments from that statement. First, it is important to note that while the State Department plays an important role in money laundering policy formulation, it is not the lead agency in implementation. We cooperate, however, on a day-to-day basis with those which have the lead on implementation: Justice, Treasury, the Drug Enforcement Administration, Customs, and other agencies. The information we have received is often based on the outcome of successful cases by those law enforcement agencies. As a result of growing administration concern and congressional concern about narcotics money laundering, we decided to add a specific money laundering chapter in our annual International Narcotics Control Strategy Report, or INCSR, beginning with the March 1988 report. The 1991 report contained a money laundering chapter of 63 pages, with detailed reports covering 122 governments. The 1989 INCSR provided 13 paragraphs of discussion of the charges against BCCI and its officers, resulting from one customs operation. Follow-up reports on this investigation of BCCI were provided in the 1990 and 1991 INCSR reports. What are the factors which made BCCI suitable for money laundering? Setting aside those instances where BCCI managers knowingly promoted money laundering, BCCI seemed attractive to traffickers for the same reasons that other banks have been found attractive. First, traffickers seek international banks that are sophisticated in wire transfers, that have branches in those parts of the world where they operate, and which permit quick retrieval of funds. Secondly, traffickers seek banks in those countries where national banking laws afford maximum secrecy to depositors, permit nominee accounts, and do not provide for close monitoring of close border transactions or currency movements. These are lessons which we have learned over the past few years. I would now like to focus on some of the actions we have taken to restrict narcotics-related money laundering. Working bilaterally and through multilateral organizations, the United States has become a leader in the effort to expand the global consensus on good banking practices to prevent narcotics money laundering. Cooperation between the financial and enforcement communities in many governments has improved considerably. This has been influenced by the ratification of the United Nations Convention Against Illicit Traffic in Narcotics, Drugs, and Psychotropic Substances, the Vienna Convention, the adoption of the recommendations of the Financial Action Task Force, the approval of the European Community's new policy directive, and other commitments, and especially by the deliberations which led to the drafting and approval of these international accords. In accord with the Vienna Convention and the Financial Action Task Force recommendations, numerous countries have adopted or are now deliberating on provisions which criminalize money laundering, regulate the flow of currency and monetary instruments, mandate records of currency and other monetary instrument transactions, require declarations of beneficial owners of accounts, and compel disclosure of suspicious transactions. The challenge, however, is becoming more complex. As we noted in our 1991 report, we are detecting money laundering schemes involving a second tier of countries which were not of major concern to us 3 years ago. Traffickers, and more particularly their professional money managers, are actively seeking those countries and territories where there are central banks with minimal capabilities, financial systems with limited controls on foreign exchange, and restrictive bank secrecy practices. We are responding by extending the dialogue throughout the world. While compliance with the Vienna Convention and the Financial Action Task Force recommendations will remain high priorities, the challenge for the future will also include the application of these same standards to non-bank financial institutions. We need to work to tighten requirements for incorporating or licensing businesses which might engage in financial transactions or make use of bearer shares or certificates. We need to develop means to regulate exchange houses and other traditional family financial systems which are at the core of financial exchanges in many developing countries around the world. In summary, Mr. Chairman, we've been aware of BCCI's involvement in narcotics money laundering for several years and have indicated that awareness in our reports to Congress. Working with officials at Justice and Treasury, we have formulated recommendations for the Financial Action Task Force and other multilateral organizations, as well as for use in our bilateral negotiations with other financial center countries on cooperative countermeasures. We have made important progress in the last few years, but there is a lot more to be done.
Thank you very much, Mr. Smith. Mr. Pope.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I'm Larry Pope, Associate Coordinator for Counterterrorism at the State Department. On August 1st, Peter Burley submitted a prepared written statement for the record, and his statement summarized the links between BCCI and terrorism as follows. In 1986, the intelligence community developed and disseminated information that linked the Abu Nidal organization and its activities to a BCCI branch in Europe through the use of front companies. The ANO traded profitably.
What's the date on that again? I'm sorry.
1986, sir.
1986.
The ANO traded profitably and successfully in weapons, construction services, and other business enterprises. Based on the information developed by the intelligence community, we launched a major diplomatic effort to have the concerned governments, which included the previous communist regimes in East Germany as well as Poland, expel the ANO personnel responsible for these businesses and close down the companies themselves. The efforts we made with other governments to disrupt the ANO's commercial activities were successful. The business front companies that financed a major portion of ANO's activities have been shut down. Since the August 1st hearing, the full report prepared in 1987 on the ANO front companies, on which Mr. Burley's statement was based, has been declassified. Copies of that report have been provided to subcommittee staff. We have continued to review the available information with regard to BCCI's connections to international terrorism. We have not uncovered any information indicating that the ANO or any other terrorist group received financial backing from BCCI. In a few instances, terrorist groups other than the ANO and one state sponsor of terrorism maintained accounts with BCCI branches. I regret that I'm unable to be more specific in a public hearing. Mr. Chairman, at the request of the committee staff, we have also looked into the allegations which have been made in the press about Mr. Mohammed Hammoud, a Lebanese businessman and shareholder in BCCI who died last year, with regard to his possible links to terrorist groups like Hezbollah. We do not have information which would support these allegations. The committee staff has also asked about a possible connection of the Qassar brothers to BCCI. Mundhir and Ghassan Qassar have been notorious for their involvement in an arms and narcotics smuggling network which has provided revenue for the operation of several terrorist groups, including the Abu Nidal organization. The white paper, which we have made available to the committee, discusses their activities in detail and their close connection to the business activities of the ANO, which we worked successfully to break up. We also know that the ANO had a banking relationship with BCCI, but we are not aware of evidence linking the Qassar brothers to BCCI directly, although this is plausible given their connections to the ANO. As investigation into BCCI affairs by appropriate law enforcement agencies here and overseas continues, we may learn more. We will continue to follow up any leads aggressively from the counterterrorism point of view. Thank you.
Very much. Thank you. Let me begin, if I can. Well, let me sort of run across the board here. First reports of the State Department on terrorism were 1986.
First reports of the connection between BCCI and the Abu Nidal organizations.
Were 1986.
That's correct, sir.
And drug involvement, money laundering, first knowledge?
Actually, first knowledge was in 1987 from an investigation which was then underway and which was mentioned in our 1988 report without giving the name of the bank. We were able in the 1989 report to mention BCCI specifically.
Well, that was publicly, but you had no other knowledge of their involvement in money laundering or drug activities prior to that?
We would have,
even with the existence of 5 or so branches in Medellin?
we would have seen the earlier reports, but the specific details were provided by the investigations which were underway in 1987, which began in 1987.
So you relied on the law enforcement investigations for your knowledge.
That was the primary source of our knowledge, yes.
You didn't gain it through State Department personnel in Colombia?
No, sir.
You didn't gain it from State Department personnel in Panama? Or any other Latin American country?
No, sir.
There are no reports, no cables, no information whatsoever in the State Department about banks' involvement in money laundering prior to that?
I believe we've done a complete search of our files, and this is what we've come up with, sir.
Now,
we can check again if you wish, but we have.
well, if you're convinced you've done a
search.
complete search, I don't want you to, I mean, if you've done a complete search and I see heads nodding, I take it at face value that that's when you had your first reports. Mr. Kerr, what circumstances led to the CIA becoming interested in BCCI originally? Do you know?
Well, Senator, as I indicated earlier, we had an operational lead early on in the mid-'80s that led us to focus on it, that identified it with money laundering. So that initial focus turned around the issue of narcotics money laundering, and that provided the impetus for the future focus of collection, which led to a variety of other.
And that began in the early 1980s?
In the, you know, precise date?
83, 84.
83, 84 would be the time frame.
So in 83, 84, you were gaining information regarding money laundering. Who did you disseminate that information to?
We'd have to go through specific reports, but generally our dissemination list, as I indicated, was the intelligence community, State Department, the FBI, Treasury, and in an area of narcotics, obviously, to those organizations involved in narcotics business in this, counter-narcotics in this country. So it's tailored by, our distribution is to some degree tailored by the nature of the reporting. Terrorism going one to one set of customers, narcotics information going to another, banking information going to another.
Each and every one of those activities would have involved breaking the law, is that correct?
I'm sorry, each?
Well, each of those
referred to?
activities represented legal infractions, didn't they? Money laundering, drug smuggling,
Some of those
Terrorism.
involved U.S. My assumption is that some of those clearly would involve the breaking of U.S. law. Others are involved in breaking internal local laws. So there's probably two different kinds of laws being broken. Not all of them. We obviously have obligations within the intelligence community when U.S. laws are broken to pass that information to justice and to our own law enforcement agencies. We don't have a similar obligation, obviously, when foreign laws are broken.
Agreed. You made a judgment that in 1985, you said in your testimony, you issued a report that since 1981, BCCI owned First American. Is that accurate?
I think that's a correct statement, yes.
And in 1985, when you made that judgment, to whom did you disseminate that information? Principally to Commerce and to Treasury, although our understanding is the Comptroller of the Currency was informed by Treasury. Was Justice informed?
I don't believe on that particular report it was not informed. That's right.
Was DEA?
DEA? There would be, I doubt if it was, because that was not again a narcotics issue. It was a banking issue as we would see it. I think in this case what we would see is our principal customer in the United States intelligence community as a customer of us would be Treasury, would be the logical customer for us.
Was the Fed Reserve?
No.
The Fed was not informed?
No, my understanding was not.
Is there any reason that the Fed would not be informed that a bank was illegally owned in the United States?
Our assumption at this point in time, I believe, was, and it's hard going back that long to know exactly why a report, we have two issues, though. One, sensitivity of the sourcing of the information, and the second was that Treasury, again, was what we believe to be our principal customer on information of this sort.
Now,
and our arrangements, by the way, with Treasury and as with State and with others, is that we have an intelligence component or an intelligence organization that are essentially counterpart organizations in each of those organizations that we deal with.
Now, in retrospect, does this compartmentalizing and source issue confront us with a dilemma with respect to the other interests that the banking community might have had? I mean, here you have Messrs. Clifford and Altman now hauled before committees and investigations. You have serious issues about the impact on other countries of what has happened, as testified to by the State Department. You have millions of small depositors who have been affected, not to mention a lot of businesses and so forth, as a consequence of BCCI being able to continue to do what it was doing. Now, you had knowledge in '85 that since '81, First American, by the judgment of the CIA, was, quote, owned by BCCI. Messrs. Clifford and Altman are saying they didn't know that. Where do you wind up with respect to a responsibility in terms of the banking laws of this country and the interests of the financial regulators being able to enforce that law and guarantee the soundness and safety, if you will, of the banking structure?
Well, it's easy in hindsight to make judgments about what you should, given the way things have developed. Obviously, if we had that kind of hindsight, we might have done it differently. However, at that time, I think we saw as our principal obligation, Treasury as our principal customer. We understood Treasury had formed the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, and to us, that was a very specific and direct responsibility. My only...
So in other words, you would say that you feel you informed the people who needed to be informed,
yes,
and they should have done something with it.
You'll have to ask them about their own view of that and the context they placed it in and how the subsequent their subsequent view of it. But that even in hindsight, I think that was the appropriate customer for us. In hindsight, if we had added the Federal Reserve on, that probably would have been useful for this hearing, and we would have been able to demonstrate one more. And it might have been useful at that point in time, but again, our perspective on that was that Treasury would be the logical place.
No, I understand. Well, in retrospect, does that mean that there should be a broader a dissemination list? Does it mean there should be a stricter set of guidelines as to how that kind of information is used from now on?
As I've indicated to you, we have looking at our own dissemination to see if we can make sure that we do disseminate product to the right person. It's a continual drama, after all, who's involved in what issue over a wide range of subjects. You can always improve that, and we are taking steps to improve it. One of the difficulties I think it's important to recognize is that as intelligence officers, while we have some reasonable insight into a lot of issues, we do not necessarily have full insight into necessarily what breaks the law in terms of bank or the details of banking regulations, and we really have to count on others to provide that detail. We have obviously an overview of that and have some sense of what is legal and illegal, but when you get into the fine points of acquisition of holding companies, you begin to go beyond our expertise. And also, as I said, we are not an investigative unit, we essentially are collecting intelligence for a very specific purpose. And that purpose, quite simply, in this case, was primarily, again, aimed at the illegal activities that BCCI was involved in: narcotics laundering, terrorism, support to terrorism, and other activities such as that.
Well, how many reports would you say that you
Several hundred.
disseminated through the community? Several hundred reports?
Yes, during this time frame, we disseminated several hundred.
And these several hundred reports referred to?
Primarily in the narcotics area, in terrorism, and in other reports of other kinds of activities, arms transfers, and reports of...
When did you first start sending reports of terrorist activities?
Let me ask the specific... 86, I'm told, is the first report on terrorist activity.
When did you send reports with respect to narcotics activities?
That would go back into the earlier time frame, probably in the... back at 83? 84 on.
And when did you send reports with respect to the first report, I take it, with respect to the ownership issue, was 85?
That's right, early 85.
85. So 84 or 85, you began generating a fair amount of traffic on this issue. Is that fair to say?
That's fair to say. We began at that point in time. As I said earlier, we had an operational lead that led us to focus our attention. As you might expect, we're a worldwide organization that has a lot of interest. And so we tend to, if we pick up a lead or a particular activity, then we focus some additional resources on it. But we are spread very thin when it comes to looking at all activities of everyone, everywhere.
Now, in your opening statement, you did mention that you provided information to the Fed. What kind of information was that?
Well, we have provided, and they are on our dissemination list for some products.
With respect to BCCI particularly?
I believe they were on dissemination list for a subsequent report in the what?
There were a number of reports. Yeah. I'm not sure.
They got reporting, not the initial report, though, in 1985.
Did they, in any of the subsequent reports, receive notice about the ownership that you reported in 85?
I believe so, yes.
You do believe so?
If I'm wrong.
I don't think that's quite true. I don't know that.
Let me ask Ted Price here, who's a little more specific, can be more specific.
I don't think that the Fed actually received the information.
He was saying we did not provide specific information to the Federal Reserve on the ownership issue.
Now, why did the CIA choose to use First American as a depository when it knew it was controlled by BCCI?
I assume the same reason a lot of other people used as a normal bank. It is not used. It is used to transfer money to hold accounts, savings accounts, and other activities for us. But it is not an operation used operationally. It is used as a repository for normal banking.
So the fact that you were generating reports on terrorist activities, the fact you were generating reports on narco-trafficking activities, the fact that you had an illegal ownership situation didn't give you any alarm bells about using this?
But be specific about that, Senator, and that is our information was not on First American of what you just described. Our information about that activity, terrorism, counter-narcotics, was on BCCI, and we do not, number one, collect intelligence on domestic organizations, and we did not see a link see a link in terms of the activities of First American. In other words, we had no reason to suspect First American of any of the things you just described.
But, and so the fact that First American was, according to your determination, owned by BCCI didn't matter. It was, you
I
considered
don't think
it a
that was a
separate
consideration
entity.
in terms of our own banking activities domestically, no.
Okay. Now, what about, I take it the CIA was aware that President Carter traveled to China, traveled to other countries in the presence of Mr. Abadi on a BCCI airplane.
I wouldn't assume that. We obviously would know where President Carter's going just from reading the news, but I'm not sure we had identified particularly, the mode of his travel or his association. Again, we don't collect intelligence on our former presidents or U.S. citizens.
If a president of the United States, well, I take it you had an interest in the bank. I mean, you said that.
Certainly.
Correct?
Yes.
And you were watching the bank very carefully, correct?
Again, I would say, though, it's very important to say we were watching it in terms of very specific objectives. We were not watching it as a financial institution. We were not watching the leadership in terms of its movements or its activities. What we were watching, or what we were trying to do, is collect information that we felt was, from our perspective, of national security interest. I go back to that. That was the focus. So,
was it of national security interest to you that this bank might be trying to gain a foothold in the United States in order to further specific third world or Pakistani interests?
it was sufficiently of interest to us that we provided that report to Treasury in the 85 timeframe.
If that is of interest to you, wouldn't it be rather important to you to evaluate what Mr. Abadi, the head of that organization, might be doing with the former President of the United States?
I don't think so. I think that would be I'm not sure those two are logically connected, and I'm not sure we did. I wouldn't, personally.
Would you not have been concerned about this bank that you knew was involved in narco-terrorism, knew was involved in terrorism itself, and that you knew had an illegal ownership, that it was openly appealing to the many interests in this country? I mean, is that not, did that get relayed to anybody? Was there any flag raised saying people ought to be notified here that this is not a good bank and they're getting sucked in?
Let me go back again. I said we had several hundred reports that we provided on that general kind of activity. It seems to me that is our obligation, to provide the information to the appropriate organizations and to consistently continue to collect, and we did exactly that.
Did you notify those people who could have brought legal action against this bank for its activities?
We provide information to our oversight committees and to the Congress on a wide range of things, and to the principal executive organizations involved in law enforcement and intelligence and in policy. And I think that is our obligation, and we did precisely that.
Did several hundred reports go to law enforcement?
I don't know the precise number, but certainly a large number went. Of that, certainly several hundred were disseminated. I would say many of them, depending again on the subject, would go to DEA, to drug enforcement, to the FBI, which is our principal conduit for intelligence, and to other intelligence organizations, and then the policy organizations.
Could you, Mr. Kerr, provide the committee with a categorization of those reports, a breakdown of who the reports went to, and what reports went to people over the period of that time?
I don't see why we cannot do that. It seems to me that's appropriate.
I think it would be helpful for us to understand that.
We'll provide a general characterization of the number, of roughly the numbers, and
is there any reason that the committee couldn't have the reports submitted to 207?
I'd prefer not to do that, but we can talk about how we might do that. Our problem with disseminating individual reports is we come very close into a sources and methods problem.
No. I'm not talking about disseminating. Could we put them in the intelligence safe over there so that I, at least with code clearance, could review them?
I'll be glad to pursue that with you, sir. work out
Is this going to be
some
one of those long pursuits, or can we?
Well, I'd like to look carefully at what we're talking about and how we are going to do that, and talk to our oversight committee about it, and then let us pursue that, certainly.
Well, let us pursue that.
Let us pursue it.
We will pursue that.
My problem with that, if I might add, is that we will be glad to characterize them for you. We'll be glad to give you a briefing of them. We are a little hesitant when it comes to providing access to individual raw reporting that describes sources and
Well, you were provided it to each of these departments,
yes, individually, yes.
correct?
Yes.
So if they can get it, I believe the United States Senate can get it.
Fair.
Is that fair?
Fair. A United States Senator can. We will talk further about it.
Thank you. Now, what did you learn about BCCI's involvement in the facilitating of drug trafficking or drug money laundering?
I think it's difficult to go much further into this area in terms of, except to kind of repeat what I said earlier, and that is that we did learn that there were, in a number of countries, as colleagues here have said, a number of countries, BCCI branches were facilitating the introduction of large sums of money out of the narcotics business into the banking system.
In how many countries would you say that was taking place?
I would defer earlier. I heard the number that you gave. I don't have a precise number.
We have a number of 10, which is drawn from investigations conducted by the investigative parts of the U.S. government.
When did the CIA learn about BCCI's involvement in financing international arms trade?
A specific date, I don't know. There are only a few reports of that. That is not an extensive body of information. And I don't have, well, let me ask I don't have a precise date, but we certainly can provide that date to you.
And do you recall how many instances or how significant the arms trafficking information might have been?
I think that, again, I can characterize a little better in a closed session, but let me just try to take a stab at it and say that those are indirect, and what you have are activities on the part of a bank official to move weapons or to facilitate the movement between two countries of weapons. So it is a facilitator role.
But you did learn the bank was involved in that facilitating role?
Yes, we did.
Fine. I think we can, that's the key, and I just, what did you learn about BCCI's involvement in the handling of finances of terrorist organizations?
Again, I think the characterization we had earlier was that, and that is somewhat indirect, and probably, again, I'd prefer, because of our continuing interest in this area, obviously, to not detail it, but it is primarily, again, as front men for activities on the part of terrorists and helping them with their own front companies, primarily in a funding mechanisms for terrorism.
Did you learn, and are you able to state how widespread that was within the bank structure itself?
I think it would be fair to say it was not, I mean, our knowledge of it was certainly not extensive. It's rather limited.
Fairly narrow to the
Yes.
top echelon, so to speak, to a narrow group of people?
It's limited to a specific number of very few branches and to a very specific number of organizations. I think it would be unfair, it would be
Fair enough.
to characterize it as widespread and extensive.
That's what I'm trying to get at. That's fair. What about knowledge of involvement in the movement of prohibited technologies to countries who weren't able to get those technologies on the open market?
My own view of that, and I'll have to ask the people behind me who know the detail, I don't think there is specific evidence in the technology area. There's clearly evidence of material or weapons that were not, that would not have an appropriate end user, that would not be appropriated, but I don't know of a technology issue.
Did you want to add?
That's inaccurate.
Fine. Did you learn anything about BCCI's involvement in making bribes or payoffs or any other forms of payments to foreign political leaders or heads of state, other high-ranking officials?
I don't think we have specific information on that direct.
So there were no reports with respect to any of those matters contained in these reports you made, these over 200 or so reports?
There is certainly a small number that talk about corruption or kind of sharp practices and ways to avoid local taxes, and I mean in that sense. But I think that would be the nature of the kind of reporting. Is that fair? That's, I think, a fair description of it. I think of the kind you are talking about, the kind of issue, I would say no.
Did the CIA learn anything about specific services provided to the government of China by BCCI?
No.
Okay. Did you learn anything about the involvement of BCCI in the acquisition of prescribed technologies for Iraq?
Again, I think there is some evidence of arms
Through BCCI?
through a BCCI using a front. There is some, I know, specific, but I think in arms, this is not major high technology.
What did the CIA learn with respect to the relationship with Manuel Noriega in Panama?
On that issue, I think it would be inappropriate, given the nature of a trial. Justice Department would prefer me not to talk about issues that involve Noriega. What I think that's probably appropriate guidance from my perspective.
Can you perhaps at least confirm to the committee that you, through those, that in those reports to other agencies there were reports of involvement?
What I can say is we did collect on involvement between BCCI, obviously, in Panama, and the use of BCCI Panama by major narcotics traffickers. I don't think you can, and I don't think you, in fact, can carry that statement beyond that to specifically to Noriega.
We can take that up in private session, but I just want to establish, and I think it's important to do so on the record, that you've gained information about that. What about BCCI's activities in Colombia, including involvement with drug traffickers and government officials there?
Again, there is reporting on certainly drug trafficking in Colombia. And the use, as I described earlier, of BCCI as an entry point for laundering money.
What about BCCI services provided to the government of Pakistan?
I don't have specific information on that, on the government of Pakistan. I don't think there is specific intelligence that would support that.
Can you share with the committee what the CIA learned about BCCI's secret purchase of First American in Washington?
I cannot do much more than I described to you earlier, and that is that in early '85, we had information indicating that the BCCI had acquired the holding company as early as 1981, and we provided that information in a report form. But we have very little other to say about that, or in fact, there is very little more to say about that. We got subsequent information on that issue later, but it did not change the fundamental report of 1985.
How would you describe the nature and extent of the agency's use of BCCI for its operations?
We used it as a normal bank to move with accounts in that bank. As I said, we used it. Those accounts were associated with lawfully kind of authorized activities that have been briefed to our oversight committee, so there's nothing that we were doing that they were not aware of. We also used it as an access mechanism to collect against the bank itself. The amounts involved are relatively small, are quite small relative to the size of the bank and to our own activities. So
how many accounts would you say there were, Mr. Kerr?
I'd rather not specify them if I can, but there were not very many.
Did BCCI employees know of that?
No, they did not.
No employees anywhere in BCCI were aware of this?
No, officials in the bank were not aware of the use that we were putting the accounts to.
Was that true initially of
That is
First
true.
American also?
Well, First American is quite a different, after all, a U.S. bank with domestic accounts where...
No, I understand. I'm just curious whether...
Certainly, they know that there are accounts from CIA. First American did.
Okay.
I mean, they are open, acknowledged accounts. Is that fair?
Now, you say that under no circumstances...
Some of them are, yeah.
Now, you have said that BCCI was a target,
Yes,
and BCCI became a target when?
mid-'80s. 83, I think. Yeah.
So, given Mr. Abedi's contacts within the intelligence community, or given his perception that something was happening with respect to his bank, i.e., I think he felt that people were following him, questions were being asked of people, somehow there was an interest in the bank, it would not be inconsistent for him to say, which he is alleged to have said by a number of people, Mr. Burt Lance, Mr. Sakia, and Mr. Rahman, have all said Mr. Abedi felt the bank was on the CIA watch list. So there's a consistency, I take it, between the time frame of your saying BCCI was targeted and his perception that something was going on with the CIA, as he characterized
I
the
wouldn't
CIA
accept that
watch
at all.
list.
I wouldn't accept that connection as at all legitimate. One, hopefully and presumably he did not know his bank was being targeted by us. None of his employees did, and we were doing it in a way where he wouldn't know. That was the whole object of it, and nor would anybody in the BCCI. So I think the idea...
Could there have been a leak through this intelligence network somehow? He seemed pretty sure of it.
Well, you'll have to talk to him, but it depends whether you have confidence in what he says or what I'm saying right now. And what I say is that, in fact, it may have been, I mean, you never say never, obviously, but in fact, we know of no connection.
Do you know who Mr. Bruce Rappaport is?
Only vaguely, yes. I know the name, yes.
Has he had any dealings with the agency?
I don't know the answer to that personally, whether we...
Do any of your answerers behind you know the answer to that?
Yeah, that's the issue we'd prefer to talk about in closed session.
How about a Mr. Alfred Hartman?
Sir, I would rather not go down a list of people and determine whether or not we know
That's
them or
fair.
not. I think that's inappropriate.
I won't do that. That's fair. Why don't we go through that part of it during the closed session? I do have some more questions, but let me turn to my colleague.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a
Senator
couple
Brennan.
questions here. Mr. Kerr, have you identified who within your organization was charged with dissemination of this 85 report and made the decision not to forward it to the Federal Reserve?
The individual involved, I think we know generally the rationale for why it was disseminated the way it was. Yes, I wouldn't...
Do we know who made that decision to not identify the Federal Reserve?
I don't think I would put it that way. I think it was a decision to notify Treasury, and I'm not sure whether it was a conscious decision not to notify the Federal Reserve at all. We went to what we thought was our principal customer in that area, so I'm not sure I would phrase the question the way you just did.
Let me try again. We're all products of the training we've had. My training was that somebody's supposed to take responsibility.
Someone did take responsibility.
And when the decision is made that is a bad decision, you identify who made it.
I'm not sure it was a bad decision.
Well, you may feel that a failure to get information about a criminal activity to the Federal Reserve is not. I have a different view of it. That's an honest difference of opinion. Well, I guess my question is, have you identified who made this decision?
I have not. I don't think we've identified the particular individual, but we know the group that it came out of. We know the individuals that were involved in it. But the answer is yes, we would be able to, but I don't know what the point of that question is.
Well, the point is very clear. If the decision is to made that this kind of conduct of not identifying the appropriate agency is to change, that if your agency is aware of criminal misconduct with regard to banks, an effort to conceal the ownership of banks, that the conduct of the agency in the future should be different. And the only way I think you make a change in that is to identify who's in charge of making this decision.
Well, in that regard, Senator, I can say, as I mentioned to Senator Kerry earlier, we have looked at our own decision-making process about how we disseminate reporting, and we are looking at it with the benefit of hindsight. We tend to learn by our own experiences, so we are going to examine that rather carefully, and you can rest assured that we will look with greater care on that. At that time, however, even in hindsight, I think the decision that was made to give it to Treasury, that gave it to the Office of Comptroller, was a legitimate decision based on our understanding of who the logical people had responsibility for it.
Well, obviously.
So we are looking at and we will look at our own process. That's one thing that our Inspector General, in his review, looking at it, suggested that that's an area where we need to look at our own consistency and our own dissemination of reports, and we are doing that.
I guess the question then is, and perhaps you've answered it, is that you have not identified who is in charge of this area and who made this decision, and you have not disciplined.
I'm not going to discipline anybody for that mistake. That was an honest mistake, and I wouldn't think of doing that. Errors of judgment, I might add.
Is there a policy change at CIA now as a consequence of this?
I wouldn't say a policy change. It is a look. What we are doing is looking again at our distribution, how we distribute reports. And I said we have worldwide reports on a variety of different issues.
But apart from just distributing, I mean, I suppose you could make the decision to just distribute and include 6 more people on the distribution list, but it doesn't really guarantee that it's going to come to the attention of somebody in that flagged way that says, folks, somebody ought to do something here. Is there?
Well, that's why we also call specific attention to people to the reports. In fact, we did on this report in 1985 in Treasury. We made a particular point of calling it to attention. We got specific tasking back on.
Whose attention was it called to in 1985?
I'm not sure the individual at this point in time, but it was discussed with the individual in the intelligence area of Treasury. We got some specific requirements back on it. So we felt we had done essentially done our particular job in this.
But did it go to secretary level? Did it ever get to a sort of decision?
I don't know the answer to that, whether it was called to the attention of the secretary.
My question to you is, do you think it should be now, retrospectively? Do you think that there ought to be a policy change that says, hey, folks, if we come across illegal activity in the course of our intelligence gathering that reflects on U.S. government law that ought to be enforced, we now have an obligation to give to so-and-so or something? Is that?
I don't think, quite simply, that's given the volume and the nature of the intelligence business, any general rule about that, it requires judgment. It requires a variety of different things in a process. I think any general rule says you give everything on a particular category to a certain group probably would be unwise, given the nature and the complexity and the volume of information of the category you're talking about. So I think you have to have within organizations people who are responsible for making decisions. In this case, we did. Even in hindsight, I would say we gave it to the right people. We called it to their attention. We followed up with information. So I feel relatively comfortable about that. Would I have now preferred to have given it to others? The answer is yes. Hindsight is a marvelous, gives clarity to your understanding.
Well, pardon me, but this was criminal behavior.
And it was given to the...
It doesn't take a genius to figure out when criminal behavior is going on. You let the applicable agency know that something is...
And we believe we did that.
Well, can you tell us who at Treasury this was sent to?
I was sent to the Chief of Intelligence at Treasury and called to their attention.
But intelligence, I mean, this gets back to the training issue that Senator Brown brought up. I mean, they're going to see this in intelligence terms. They're going to see this in the context of just a sort of day-to-day missive.
I don't think that's true. I think a policy organization that has intelligence, just like states INR, sees their intelligence in policy terms. That's their job, and that's the nature of the way they look at it. So I think that's, again, quite legitimate process.
No, we are going to get a copy of the report, and I know you're trying to work that out, so I think that's helpful. But can you give us any idea, was this flagged in a way that it was noted as a
It was flagged and noted, yes.
Thank you.
Is there a policy, this is a little bit a field, but it's not a field. It's something that's interested this committee over a number of years. In fact, the original investigation of this committee grew out of a sense of this conflict. We've had witnesses in the Noriega trial who have already testified publicly that they flew weapons one place and flew drugs back the other. And it was because they were acting sort of under cover of quote intelligence, not official, but under that cover, that they were able to do that. There are a legion of allegations over the years of this confusion between intelligence goals and the need for secrecy and the need to maintain sources and the need sometimes to deal with really nefarious types in order to get the information you need to get, and then what they're doing, the activity they're engaged in, and the impact that might have on us of your keeping those sources secret. Has there been a review of that kind of issue? I mean, I'm really talking about narcotics trafficking. When you have money launderers and narcotics dealers who are also intelligence sources of one kind or another, maybe third-party source to somebody in another country whom you've sourced or something, what happens? I mean, is there a tension there?
Certainly, there is a tension. It's an issue of constant concern. It's an issue where we have some very specific instructions and direction in terms of our ability and to deal directly with narcotics traffickers. Is a very complicated process for that, and a vetting process. It is, as you say, a very difficult process. It's a little, however, like saying that the police shouldn't deal with criminals. To collect intelligence, you need to deal with the people who are the targets.
Absolutely.
And so it's a very complex issue, but we have oversight mechanisms that we report to on this issue. We have some very specific guidance as to how we deal and work with people who are involved in narcotics, the trade, and so it is a very explicit set of guidelines. If anything, it is prohibitive to the point where it makes it difficult to deal with the narcotics trafficking business, but it is certainly complicated. And there certainly is a review process, and it is an ongoing review. I mean, it just doesn't happen once a year or once a month. It happens with every specific activity.
Did you receive any information at the agency regarding BCCI or any other entity or agent of the U.S. Handling PL-480 transport, commodity credits, or other things for the Department of Agriculture programs? Did you get any information on that? I see heads shaking.
I mean, that's not an issue we would be involved in except in the most peripheral way, and I can't think of any specific example.
Now, with respect to the BCCI involvement with the financial arrangement of Mr. Ghorbanifar and Khashoggi in connection with Iran-Contra, there are documents showing $10 million through two Canadians for tow missiles that were going to go to the Ayatollah, with $1 million in additional funds that were going to be generated and split between Khashoggi and BCCI, and this is documented as well as testified to. It was aborted when our officials grew wary of Ghorbanifar. Did the CIA have any information with respect to that transaction or any role in it?
That's an issue I really don't know enough about to answer specifically about it. When you say any role or information, that's one I would have to, it's kind of off this main principal subject, and I'm just not prepared to answer it, I'm afraid.
Well, the reason I think it's part of the subject is it's a BCCI transaction involving secret accounts and involving figures who have already shown up with significant ties, about whom our community, I take it, was pretty aware.
to my knowledge, and I think that's,
If you can't answer it
Yeah.
now, Mr. Kerr, I understand, but what I would like to do is get an answer to that if we can.
Well, we can do that. I was going to see if I could go back to my own notes and see if I can provide a specific on that.
Well, are you aware of Mr. Khashoggi sending a New York oilman by the name of Roy Furmack to the CIA?
I know that based on testimony and the whole variety of other things, yes.
So you know that that Mr. Khashoggi sent a messenger to Langley to warn Mr. Casey that the Canadians were feeling swindled and were going to go public. That took place.
I know that. I'm not sure what the relevance of that is to this issue of BCCI.
Because this was all part of the same transaction. This was Mr. Khashoggi with the $10 million that was aborted, and BCCI was part of that. So the question I'm asking is whether the agency had knowledge of or involvement in that particular transaction.
Let me go back to my testimony, and I will certainly follow up and make sure it is, and that is that CIA was not involved or did not have any knowledge of the use of BCCI for the sale of arms to Iran or the diversion of funds for the Nicaraguan Contras.
Or could it be that it had knowledge of this particular transaction, which had nothing to do with those two transactions you just cited?
Certainly in hindsight, and there were people who have testified that they had knowledge of it, like Charlie Allen, I believe.
Well, if we could follow up on that, can we
If you could
agree
give us
to do
a
that?
specific question, we will be glad to follow up.
It is accurate, is it not, that the tow missiles that were to go to Mr. Ghorbanifar to Iraq were going to come from the U.S. government, correct?
That's my understanding. Again, though, I'm not sure how relevant that is to this issue. But
Well, because the reason it is relevant, I don't want to give you a sense I'm going off into some tangent here. I'm not. It's a BCCI facilitated transaction, or so it is alleged. And I'm trying to understand from our side of the fence what we knew about it. We have documents showing the transaction in its nascent form. And the question is, to what degree we may have been leveraging that transaction, pushing it, part of it, or what?
yeah, again, I go back. We have no evidence and no knowledge of involvement in the use of BCCI for the sale of arms to Iran or in the Iran-Contra issue. And so that's about all I can say. Having said that, I can't do much more.
Do you have any knowledge, or did the agency have any knowledge of a BR&W Industries Limited and its use financed by BCCI for the shipment of tow missiles? None that you
No,
think
none
of
that
now?
I know of.
Okay, all right. Let me ask you this. While the agency may not have approved of it formally, and while it may not have been transacted through agency procedures, do you or does the agency now have any information that Mr. Casey somehow, in that sort of separate series of transactions that he did, used BCCI in connection with the financial transactions related to the Iran-Contra sale?
I have no knowledge, although I would question your one assumption of separate transactions, because I don't think there's evidence for that either. But no, the answer is no.
Well, on the contrary, there is evidence of, significant evidence of Oliver North having been dealing with Mr. Casey and talking to him, and of information that he was aware of outside of the normal loop with respect to the entire thing that has consumed Mr. North's life for the last few years.
I wouldn't want to get into a debate or an argument on that, but I think that evidence is primarily hearsay and not evidence. But
well, just asking the questions. Kamal Adam, if I could just ask you very quickly, could you define to us what you understood Kamal Adham's role to be in BCCI?
I'm afraid I have very little information on that other than what's obvious to you and what has been in the public record.
So you have no other information through the agency?
It's not an intelligence subject of intelligence interest particularly. We can, if you, that's a subject that we might explore if you want to pursue that in closed session. But
I would appreciate that if we could. Yeah, the other questions I have here really are closed session questions. With respect to the State Department, if I could just ask you, gentlemen, do you see any of our interests, policy interests, now impacted as a consequence of the fallout in any of the countries that you've talked about at this point? Is there a sense that this has that kind of impact, or is it more of a moving event that will not really have an impact? i.e., are the central banking funds of such order that are missing in a particular country that we have to be concerned about the fall of a government or about recriminations that somehow would affect outlook or anything? Is there any sense of that at this point?
Senator, I would hesitate to be too categoric because of the ongoing investigations primarily in Latin America and Argentina and Peru, for example. But I think generally, as a general matter, your statement is correct, but depending upon the outcome of investigations in those types of countries.
Would it be your perception that attitudes have changed in any of these countries or with any of the nations we're currently negotiating with on financial transactions with respect to bank secrecy and money laundering?
Mr. Chairman, I think that attitudes have changed greatly over a period of time on that subject, as evidence of the evidence by the responses of countries which have participated in the Financial Action Task Force, the widespread progress on implementing the recommendations of that task force, the attendance by other countries in the regional meetings which the task force members have promoted, the efforts by European countries to pierce the veil of bank secrecy and to take various other steps which would greatly strengthen the system to prevent this type of thing.
Well, why have we not been more successful in doing that in Panama, for instance? Panama has more money laundering today than it did before we had an invasion.
I would say in the case of Panama that we have recently had one action, which I believe has just occurred this week, which is we have sent to the Senate the mutual legal assistance agreement, which we have negotiated with Panama, which will greatly facilitate our ability to deal with the Panamanian government on issues deriving from money laundering investigations.
Could you share with us, Ms. Pope, what terrorist organizations made use of BCCI? Was it only the Abu Nidal?
Senator, I'm afraid in this session I can't be more specific about precisely the identity of those organizations because of concerns that Mr. Kerr has alluded to.
Okay. Can you tell us what the nature of BCCI's activity was? Did they actually provide financing in addition to providing banking services?
No, sir. To the best of our knowledge, it did not include financial backing.
So to the best of your knowledge, it was really just banking service?
That's correct.
Was there something that made BCCI particularly attractive to these organizations?
I think it would be they were clearly an organization, a bank that had a Middle Eastern reputation. These organizations were operating in the Middle East, of course. They may have been a bank that had a reputation for providing secrecy and not asking too many questions.
Were they involved in financing any state-sponsored terrorism that you know of?
Not to the best of my knowledge, sir.
Have you been able to evaluate how extensive the involvement of BCCI was with the central banks of countries, or are you still trying to do that?
Senator, we do not generally have reports on involvement of central banks. What we can say is that we have reports that in Pakistan, China, Peru, Jamaica, Cameroon, Nigeria, Zimbabwe, and Zambia, central banks or other government agencies may have made reserve deposits with BCCI, but those are reports that we can't necessarily confirm.
Now, we've had evidence before this committee of BCCI assisting in the movement of nuclear technology and nuclear-grade materials. Have you had either the CIA or State Department similar information?
I think, Senator, that some of that would have to be handled in closed session, but there is a case that was prosecuted successfully against a Pakistani national by the name of Pervez for an attempt to procure in the United States nuclear-related materials, and BCCI was involved in the financing of that. That's a matter of public record. I don't believe that there is an indication that BCCI was involved in illegal activity necessarily, but BCCI was involved in the financing.
Mr. Kerr?
No, I think that's I know nothing beyond what was described. I know about the case. Quite simply, I did not know that BCCI was involved in that particular case, but we may have had information on it.
Did you have any information, either of your departments, with respect to a sale of jets to Iraq, to Saddam Hussein, through Argentina?
No.
No, Senator.
Did you have any information, either of you, with respect to BCCI's involvement with Rajiv Gandhi and his government?
No.
Did you have any information with respect to BCCI's involvement with government figures in Sri Lanka?
No.
With respect to Latin America, did you have any information with respect to BCCI's involvement with Alan Garcia in Peru?
If Senator, we have someone from the Latin America Bureau, if I could ask her to join the table.
If you could just identify yourself. Everybody's willing to give up their microphones, so don't worry.
They're eager. I'm Roberta Jacobson. I'm the Deputy Director of the Policy Planning and Coordination Office at the Bureau of Inter-American Affairs. Our information on Alan Garcia in Peru has come primarily through recent news reports over the past year or so out of Peru. He's been alleged...
I realize what he's been alleged to in the newspapers, but did you have any information from your sources or yourselves with respect to that?
We had no information at the time or since then through our own information.
Senator, if I think going through a list is somewhat of a problem for us.
Well, I think
either negatively or positively.
Well, I'm not sure. I mean, if you say that we had some information, we don't have to go into what it was, but I think it would be helpful to have a sense of it. I think it's helpful to know that you didn't have a lot of the information. It indicates something. I mean, it either indicates that, well, I won't get into what it might indicate, but leave it alone. Did you have any information regarding the sale of arms to Iraq at any time? No. Okay.
No.
Fine. Let me just check. Senator Brown, do you have some more? Do you want I'm just advised by staff that apparently the Fed has already said publicly that you folks provided some information on Kamal Adham, and I just wanted to confirm that since they've said it publicly or not. We won't go into the details of what you may have provided, but do you recall providing the Fed information on Kamal Adham?
I don't know the answer to that.
This was before the Fed approved this is way back when Financial General Bank Shares was in the takeover process. And in the original effort to seek permission for the investors to come in, since Kamal Adham was one of the original investors, there was testimony that people checked with intelligence sources, and there was some evidence to the effect that, according to the Fed, that they received information from you, or from the agency, not from you personally, with respect to that. Do you have does anybody have a recollection of that?
We responded, I understand, to a request from them for information, which we subsequently passed. I can't.
Is there a record of what might have been passed on?
I would assume there would be, yes.
Would you be willing to check that, please,
Certainly.
and see if we could ascertain that? I think it would simply be helpful in completing the record. It's no great issue, but it would help complete the loop here. Senator Brown?
Mr. Kerr, I know you dealt with this in opening statements and by reference, but I thought it might be worthwhile to go back through with what specifics we have with regard to Mr. Lance's allegations about the Central Intelligence Agency. Specifically, what he had referred to before the committee was that Mr. Abadi and the BCCI had, in effect, turned into the bank of the CIA. We don't have a lot of specifics relating to this charge, but what we do have are three things. One, the allegation by Mr. Lance that Mr. Abadi was on the CIA watch list. With regard to this specific, do you know if that is the case?
No, that's not true.
It's not the case.
It's not the case.
He also had indicated that Mr. Abadi had been placed in CIA holding rooms during some of his visits and harassed by the CIA. One can only hope that's not sexual harassment, but
That's
whatever do you know if that's true?
Whatever it was, it's not true.
He also alleged that in 1984, the treatment.
Is that one of those CIA blanket denials, or is that whatever it wasn't true?
He also alleged that in 1984, the treatment changed, with the implication that that was when they developed a working operation with the CIA. Any comment on that?
Well, seeing that the first was true, the second is not true. It didn't change because there was none in the first place.
There was no change. Well, I appreciate you going through those specifics with me, because obviously I think it's helpful to have a clear denial or a clear setting of the record straight on what specifics we do have. Thank you.
I might say that we need to go into the closed session in order to go through some of those personalities and other aspects of it that I hope can give us a full sense of that. One thing that has attracted a lot of attention in this is this whole so-called black network, which we have not heard a significant amount of evidence on. We've read about it, but always through indirect sources, et cetera. Individual bank officers have testified to incidences of threats and to efforts to intimidate them or keep them quiet or so forth. my question to you is, that was a pretty extensive network that was outlined and some fairly dark activities. To what degree does your intelligence data correspond or document that kind of activity with respect to the BCCI bank?
We probably can expand on that in closed session, but it seems to me that the most obvious answer and the accurate answer of this in this session would be that the things that we have described to you earlier as illegal activities obviously constituted a fairly sizable activity on the part of the bank. There also, presumably, and was a legitimate side of banking operations, loans, et cetera, et cetera. So I think part of it is seeing this kind of two-sided organization is seen by the nature of the intelligence that we collected over that extensive period of time to show that there was, in fact, a side of that which practiced in, if not illegal, certainly was illegal, but also kind of shady activities. My assumption is that there's also a more formal legal side of it. Whether it was quite simply a neat line between the two, I personally don't know. My instincts would tell me that's probably not the case. But we can expand on that if you wish in closed session. But that's, I think, a fair statement of it.
I would appreciate it. Now, in sort of larger fashion, as we wrap up the open session part of this, there was a lot of information floating around, obviously. Some of it really going back, and I understand 20/20 hindsight is what it is, but you go back to the early struggle, you did have some regulators who were saying, don't do this. One in particular in Virginia had to literally be overruled because he was so concerned about the lack of financial data, about the obvious joint ties. Now, that's more financial than it is your business or your business. But early indications in England and elsewhere were that there were problems in 1978, 1977, 1979, and so forth. You began to get wind of those in the 80s. And by the mid-80s, there was evidence of narco-terrorism, narco-trafficking, money laundering, involvement with terrorist groups, arms trafficking, and obviously of an illegal ownership. From 1985 on until there was the one effort in Miami, in Tampa, excuse me, this just sort of went on, grew, got larger. A new bank was bought in America, National Bank of Georgia, and their branching and agencies grew in this country. What happened? I mean, is it fair to say something went wrong? That something that should have happened didn't?
Well, you're in a better position, quite simply, to answer that question than I am.
Well, what do you think?
But I would say
you're a policy person. You're running an agency.
Yeah. I am an intelligence officer, and I collect information. And my assessment, or my companion,
that's right. We're still arguing whether it's policy person or not.
Would be that what I do is collect information systematically based on what I either know to be the requirements, or what I interpret to be, or what I see should be the requirements, which is exactly what we did. We saw.
But are you happy with the outcome? I mean, as a person who's done that, do you think your work met the response that it should have met with?
I think I am happy with our collection activity and happy with our output. I'm often not happy with what I see, how I see our information used, but that's bigger than my...
Well, was it used?
You're in a better position, quite honestly, in these to know how well it was used. We certainly had follow-up questions to it. People paid attention to it. We issued a lot of information. We provide a lot of information.
But what really should have happened never happened. The bank should have been shut down. I mean, it didn't happen until the Bank of England shut it down in 1991, correct?
I'm afraid you have to talk to the regulators and those who deal with the other side of this business.
State Department, do you have a comment on...
From our standpoint, Senator, the bulk of the information that we were receiving fell into the two areas that we've mentioned, which is terrorism and money laundering, where we believe we took appropriate steps in response. We were not receiving information about foreign reserves being deposited in the bank, or about the bank's insolvency, or even, with a few exceptions, about corruption within the bank.
Well, obviously, you know, 2020 is 2020, but I don't want to be unfair about it. But on the other hand, an awful lot of information was being given to people, including by this committee, incidentally, as early as 1988. And it just seems like nobody wanted to respond. Nobody, for whatever reason, and I'm not assigning any conspiracy to it, and it obviously didn't involve you, any of you at this table, because that's not your job. But the information you were generating was not being responded to. And it's hard to understand how so many different pieces of what is now this enormous banking scandal that was sitting in front of everybody didn't come. Now, maybe there needs to be a real overhaul of the evaluative final product process, as you have suggested, you have undertaken to a degree within your agency, but some means of pulling this stuff together or something, I don't know. Maybe the Financial Crimes Center will have that capacity through its computer and so forth. I don't know. But it's obviously very disturbing to people, and I'm sure extraordinarily disturbing to those people who consider themselves the victims of this quite publicly, that there were so many levels of knowledge and yet it never reached a point of having something happen.
Mr. Chairman, if I could add on that, I was looking back on the timing. I don't know the exact date when the investigation began, but I do note that in the report we published in 1989, we referred to the customs investigation as a 30-month investigation. That report was, our report was published in early 1989, so that would take the investigation back to having started in 1986. Now, that is not prompt action, but it does, if the reports originated in the early 80s, but it does indicate that an investigation was underway as early as 1986, and it was a very lengthy and detailed investigation which resulted in indictments 30 months later.
Let me just say to you that will open a whole series of larger questions which are not your area of concern specifically. But since this committee has had an enormous amount to do with that investigation and with what has happened since, I'll just share with you, since you raised it, that the Operation Sea Chase did not grow out of any communication that came from the CIA or from a department. There was no initiation of that investigation from Washington, D.C., or from any United States agency. It happened because some people happened to stumble on it who were good customs agents down in Tampa, and they started it on their own. And they have complained publicly. In fact, one of them resigned because he was so disgruntled with the lack of resources and lack of commitment to follow through on it. So the simple reality is that happened indeed, and people are trying to claim credit for it as evidence of some terrific effort. But the tapes that were turned over by this committee, the communications that were turned over by this community, the articles that were written in major newspapers about ownership of the bank that was illegal were met with stony silence and lack of action. Now, that is not your fault, not your fault. Has no bearing on this thing. But since you raise the point and try to assert that that was an outgrowth of it, I have to counter you and say it had nothing to do with it. It just didn't. And you know, that's why it's hard to understand with all of this. Now, I'm not, you know, I promised you at the outset, this is not a session to berate, and it's not. And we didn't come here to rehash all of that. I think you've well served us, Mr. Kerr, today in giving us a lot of the sense of this and in clearing up a lot of things. And I think it's been very helpful to have you on record doing that. I appreciate it enormously. Do you have anything to add? All right, do you have any questions that you want?
Just, I would like the State Department, I guess Mr. Pope might be the one to respond to give us some idea of what you all did or didn't do in terms of advising the other countries that have been, in effect, victimized here of the intelligence we had on BCCI? Did the State Department see it as their responsibility to advise other governments of BCCI's activities?
Senator, I can speak to the issue from a counterterrorism point of view. As I've tried to outline, we did work with other governments when we received information about the front companies that were associated with the Abu Nidal organization. And in that connection, there was a great deal of cooperation with foreign governments that was designed to to dismantle that network as that information came to us.
It may be that a significant portion of what we're concerned about here probably doesn't fall into the terrorism area. So perhaps it would be for someone else in the department to respond.
As I said, Senator, the bulk of the information that we were receiving came in either in the money laundering or the terrorism areas. And in those specific areas, there was cooperation with foreign governments. But we did not go out and take an initiative at any point to inform states generally that there was a BCCI problem that I am aware of, because we were not receiving information that suggested that the bank was insolvent, that the bank was about to be closed, that there was going to be an impact on local depositors.
If I could just add, Senator, our concern was with the terrorists and their activity, not with the bank. The bank was very much a byproduct of our concerns.
Can you all give me a feel for what the State Department's policy is in terms of sharing information on a commercial activity that appears to be based on fraud? And it may not be in your area of expertise or knowledge, but I think part of the question here is simply a commercial venture that appeared to be fraudulent. Is that the sort of thing we take the initiative to share with other countries?
We do have mutual legal assistance treaties with countries that are primarily executed through the Justice Department, and there would be law enforcement cooperation through that channel, but I think it would be case specific, and in this particular case, we were not getting the information that would have led us to do that, other than in the two specific areas mentioned.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Mr. Kerr, if I could ask you, would it be, could we do the closed session next week, do you think? Would you be able to be available?
I'd certainly try to be available at next week. I'll be here. I'm not sure of a schedule, but we can work something out.
If we can find a time that works. I don't think it'll be that long a session, but I would like to do it.
No, that'd be fine.
Okay, that's great. Now, normally, folks, we swear people in at the beginning of a hearing, but because it's been a long week and the chairman is excused for doing it at the end of the hearing today, I do want to ask you if you would just rise so I can swear for your testimony today. And
does this commit me forever now to this? What follows?
Do you swear to tell the truth? Do you swear that you have told the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Thank you very much. Gentlemen, if we could do the closed session, hopefully, really as soon as possible, and I just ask your cooperation in helping us to do that, that'd be very good. Thank you. Apologize.
But I mean, it's done. If not, we'll definitely plan for that. Hi. This is Kenny Jester. Is this coming? Are you both in good shape? Yeah. We're a little further. I'll look on the We're also are you guys taking off right away, or? Yeah. Wow, that's what it was. So, I want to get great. So I will. I'm actually, we're going down to Charlottesville this weekend. I'm seeing probably tomorrow. Okay. I'll call you this weekend. And, theoretically, actually, if you did come up, anyway, send my love. Definitely. And things end up getting really crazy because we're wedding and stuff like that. After things calm down, before we say all right. It's great to see you again. It's good to see you. I'm glad you recognized me. I never. No, not at all. Okay, take care. Okay.
That concludes this hearing of the Senate Foreign Relations Subcommittee, which is investigating the activities of the Bank of Credit and Commerce International. This reminder that the hearing will re-air tonight on C-SPAN at 8 p.m. Eastern Time, 5 o'clock for our West Coast viewers.
C-SPAN